Why, hello everyone, and welcome back to Thinkology. My name's Oz, and I'm your local floor goblin, here to hit your kneecaps with an aluminum bat to bring you down to my level so I can regale you with interesting facts and knowledge. In today's interesting fact, we're going to talk about social media and its somewhat addicting properties. Fun! Now, more than 3 billion people have smartphones today, and out of that number, around 1 billion of them are active Instagram users, and TikTok is pretty frantically growing at the moment towards a potentially similar size. Even though so many people are using these platforms, what do we know about their addictive qualities? Is putting our phone down easier said than done? Let's get into that. Now, to really answer this question, we have to first understand what even is social media, and also what is an addiction. Turns out, neither one is actually really that easy to define. According to the Office of Communications and Marketing at Tufts University in Boston, social media refers to the means of interactions among people in which they create, share, and/or exchange information and ideas in virtual communities and networks. This is about as broad of a definition as you're going to find anywhere. Although they do go on and specify and narrow their focus down to YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I was unaware people still use LinkedIn. Meanwhile, addiction is defined by the American Psychiatric Association as a complex condition in which there's uncontrolled use of a substance despite the harmful consequences. If that sounds fairly broad to you, then you're not alone. Now, the truth is we still cannot predict who will and will not experience addiction, and we're still developing our understanding of what it is. We generally understand that genes play a role, and environment and trauma oftentimes play a role, and that certain biological factors such as mental illness can play a role as well. Unfortunately, we still have a ways to go in being able to provide treatments that are reliably effective. Even with the knowledge that we have on addiction, less than 20% of those treated for alcoholism remain sober for a full year after treatment, and less than 10% of those treated for opiate dependencies remain opiate-free, and more than half reuse within the first week. And please, this is not saying that those people who are struggling aren't trying. Addiction is one hell of a thing to suffer with. Now, these numbers, they don't account for intent, but they just simply prove how hard addiction is to face. It's not as easy as just simply stopping. Brains kind of suck when it comes to that. Now, to further add to this amalgamation of confusion, defining addiction is also a complex task because of other varieties. For example, gambling. Gambling is recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders as a type of addiction, or more formally, an impulse control disorder. A psychiatrist and addiction expert at UCLA named Timothy Fong told Scientific American in 2013 the past idea was that you need to ingest a drug that changes neurochemistry in the brain to get addicted. But we now know that just about anything we do alters the brain. It makes sense that some highly rewarding behaviors, like gambling, can cause dramatic changes too. Now, if modern science tells us that addiction is associated with more rewarding behaviors than it is with neurochemistry, does that mean we really could be addicted to something like social media in a clinical sense? Now, first, we should probably be trying to define what social media really is in the first place, and maybe with a bit more specificity than Tufts University. Now, I think the truth is that when most people use the term social media, they're really referring to a specific set of internet platforms like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Those are probably the most commonly thought of as they're among the most popular. Yet, even though Facebook is the most popular platform on Earth with 2.7 billion users, the second and third most popular platforms are actually YouTube, then WhatsApp, each with roughly 2 billion users. Now, and that's what gets interesting, is do you think of YouTube and WhatsApp as social media platforms? Like, I personally see WhatsApp as akin to like a messaging app, and YouTube is more of like a media platform. Social media for me mostly means something like TikTok or Instagram. But now that's the thing. If you think about it, they're both internet platforms. They're both free to sign up for and free to use, and they both generally focus around creating content, consuming content, and talking to other users. Another key feature, less overt with WhatsApp but more obvious with YouTube, is the existence of news feeds and various mechanisms like algorithms and notifications, all which are designed to keep you on the app for as long as possible. Now, these platforms are all based on a fairly simple business model. You get to use them for free, but you have to look at ads. However, that alone isn't enough to distinguish modern social media as a unique phenomenon. Like, radio and TV have operated the same way for many decades. CEOs of social media companies will oftentimes get criticized for having the financial incentive to keep people on their apps. Don't take this as me defending them. Trust me, you wouldn't catch me dead defending any of Mark Zuckerberg's actions. But I'm just saying it's not inherently obvious why it's any different from TV networks and radios having the same financial incentive to keep listeners and viewers on the air. Many would argue, including numerous of former employees at social media companies in the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, that modern social media platforms are inherently different because of their ability to track your behavior and manipulate it. But in fact, that also fails to entirely distinguish them from past iterations like TV and radio. The Nielsen Corporation has been analyzing consumer behavior for big companies since the 1920s, and as early as the 1950s, they started installing devices called audiometers, like audience meters. Clever. In TVs, which were expressly designed to track user behavior and provide reports to networks about who was watching what, when, where, and for how long. What's different about modern social media? Well, mostly that it's just simply a more advanced version of the same thing. This is not a new idea. Now, more similar still, many have also worried for a long time that we were and continue to be addicted to TV. In 1992, well over a decade before the founding of Facebook, Pink Floyd bassist Roger Waters released a solo album called Amused to Death that was largely themed around TV. Here's just a little sample of the lyrics from the title track. And if you expect me to sing it, you're dead wrong. Out in the valley, warm and clean, the little ones sit by the TV's screen. No thoughts to think, no tears to cry, all sucked dry, down to the very last breath. Bartender, what is wrong with me? Why am I so out of breath? The captain said, excuse me, ma'am, this species has amused itself to death. Now, were we addicted to amusement in the form of TV and radio long before social media? Is social media really brand new, or just the logical progression of something that has been going on for decades? I'll be the first to admit, I'm not really sure. In my view, social media is part of a larger, deeper, older phenomena of human civilization, and as a result, social media is surprisingly hard to assign a neat, tidy definition to. It's also apparently much harder than I would have ever imagined to really define addiction in any way beyond the most basic understanding. We're still learning why people struggle with addiction, how best to treat it, and most relevantly, what it is possible to become addicted to in the first place. This is going to make the question of whether or not we, both as individuals and as a society, are addicted to social media pretty hard to answer. But hey, it may not be impossible. It's not like we know nothing about these two phenomena. You don't have to wear a lab coat or read academic studies to recognize how smartphones look different, act differently, and constitute a different novel experience that has dramatically transformed society and culture in the last decade or two. You also don't need to be a doctor to understand what it means to be an addict as far as a basic concern for human well-being goes. Perhaps a better question to start with would be, are these devices and the aforementioned apps on them causing us harm? And if so, are we still unable to stop using them? In a remarkably short time, platforms like Facebook and Twitter have created many large impacts, both positive and negative. Despite being so new and so fast-paced, we are increasingly becoming more and more aware of these impacts too. So, what are some of the notable changes we've seen since the onset of modern social media, and what, if anything, have we done about it? A Pew poll conducted in July of 2020 revealed that 2/3 of the US population believes social media is having a mostly negative effect on the way things are going in the country today. When asked to elaborate, the most common reason given was the spread of misinformation. Now, those concerns are not unfounded. In 2014, several Russian organizations, including the Internet Research Agency, formed something called a troll farm. Here's how Special Agent Robert Mueller, that's a name I've heard in a while, describes it in the official affidavit. Defendants, posing as US persons and creating false US personas, operated social media pages and groups designed to attract US audiences. These groups and pages, which address divisive US political and social issues, falsely claimed to be controlled by US activists when, in fact, they were controlled by defendants. Defendants also used the stolen identities of real US persons to post on organization-controlled social media accounts. Over time, these social media accounts became defendants' means to reach significant numbers of Americans for purposes of interfering with the US political system, including the presidential election of 2016. This report goes on to say that according to data from Facebook, over a third of the US population was exposed to the dishonest and manipulative content between 2014 and 2017. During that same period, Twitter data shows that in just the 2 months leading up to the 2016 election alone, more than 36,000 Russian bot accounts published more than 130,000 tweets, which were seen close to 300 million times. Now, of course, you've almost certainly heard about this already, and I would highly advise that you look at the sources before you make a very nasty comment. And, it's been an insanely controversial issue in the recent years, yeah, but in general, the outrage about misinformation has been virtually universal, despite stark divisions across political lines. So, with such pervasive concerns about the trustworthiness of platforms like Facebook and Twitter, have people begun changing their usage? Well, technically, yes, they have. People around the world have started using social media way more. Yeah. Now, since the founding of the Russian troll farm in 2014, the number of active monthly users on Facebook has nearly tripled. I wonder they haven't done anything about it. Holy shit. Twitter hasn't grown quite as dramatically, but still, from 2014 to 2019, monthly active users on Twitter rose from 255 million to 330 million. Now, in other words, as awareness about misinformation spread and public perception of the platform's decline, usage increased. The less healthy we've thought social media is for us, the more we've used it. That kind of sound like an addiction to you? You might also agree from a less data-driven and more observational standpoint, discussions about how healthy social media is have increased in popular culture in just the last few years. Staring at our phones was previously something only our grandparents and teachers were uptight or worried about, and now it's something young people and influencers seem to be questioning too. While ironically, my grandparents are using their phones more than ever. And honestly, I find it quite disturbing that amidst all of that, our use of these platforms have actually accelerated. Here I am discussing it with you now on one of them. So if millions upon millions of us are really addicted, just why? Now, one of these answers might be, which some of you may have been screaming for the past, 13 minutes, because these platforms are literally designed to be as addictive as possible. Just ask Asa Raskin. In 2006, Raskin was working for a company called Humanized. Raskin's work included designing user interfaces for computers. He is credited with inventing a technology called infinite scroll, which is what allows you to scroll through your newsfeed for hours at a time. His description of work and the work of other engineers is both direct and scary. He says, behind every screen on your phone, there are generally literally 1,000 engineers that have worked on this thing to try to make it maximally addictive. He also describes the technology in modern smartphones as being like behavioral cocaine. Additionally, a former operations manager at Facebook named Sandy Parakilas has spoken out along similar lines. In fact, according to Parakilas, the Facebook team's key measure of success has been how addicted users are to their product. Of course, he also says they used a much nicer word for it, engagement. But here's how Parakilas describes the metric of engagement. Of the people who use it every month, how many users use it every day? So basically, as a ratio, how many people are addicted such that they use it every single day? Facebook meticulously tracks and analyzes user behavior, says Parakilas. What are people engaging with? What are they clicking on? What are they liking? Which features are they actually utilizing and using to connect and share and use all of those features? All of this data gets incorporated into a complex algorithm that customizes your newsfeed based on what you're most likely to engage with. In other words, according to Parakilas, it's optimizing for time spent. Not only are these apps designed to be addictive like drugs, but according to app developer Peter Mezek, there are two different kinds of drugs these apps can be modeled after. The first is supplements. Mezek says these are apps that quickly provide specific information such as banking apps. We might obsessively check these, but only use them very briefly at a time. However, Apps like Instagram and Facebook are, according to Mezek, not supplements, but painkillers. We open these apps without a specific idea of what we're looking for. A wide, if not virtually infinite variety of content is available in the form of posts, videos, and so on. And there's really no limit to the amount of time we could spend on there. Mezek says these apps kill the pain associated with things like boredom and loneliness. He says, the reason some apps are addictive is that most companies first ask themselves how they can make money with them. But ethical app development focuses on the user. The belief that social media is deliberately and powerfully addictive, as well as a concern over the absence of ethical app development, appear to be fairly widespread among tech experts. In fact, tech experts have recently formed a coalition called the Center for Humane Technology. This led to the production of the documentary The Social Dilemma. It also led Facebook to introduce new features allowing users to keep track of how much time they spend on the app and manage their notification settings. The fact that it's the experts in the field who are the most convinced social media is addictive is pretty damning in of itself. Still, there is strong outside evidence to support their claims as well. A study done in 2019 by the phone insurance company Asurion found that Americans check their phones an average of 96 times a day, roughly once every 10 minutes. 18 to 24-year-olds, though, check it once every 5 minutes. Compared with a similar study done just 2 years earlier, phone use had increased by 20% overall. Perhaps most disturbingly, Asurion also reported that roughly half of Americans are now going through periods where they attempt to use their phone less often, apparently to little to no avail. Sound familiar? Studies have also shown that social media use strongly correlates with self-reported health problems like increased anxiety, depression, and even decreased physical health. On their website, the producers of The Social Dilemma also blame rising political extremism on social media algorithms, which steer users towards extremist ideas and extremist communities. And remember, many of the people behind that documentary built social media as we know it. At this point, you might be thinking, what more evidence do you need? People are using their phones more and more, and the consequences are getting worse and worse. And the experts are all sounding the alarm louder and louder. We're clinically and hopelessly addicted, right? Maybe, but then again, maybe not. So much of how we interpret information is in how it's presented. It's easy to cite statistics, quote some experts, and make social media sound like the greatest threat to humankind in the world today. And who knows, maybe it is. There are certainly very compelling reasons for us to be alarmed. But it's not that simple. First of all, one could easily argue that equating social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter with illicit substances like cocaine and heroin is simply unrealistic. Cocaine may be a multi-billion-dollar industry and therefore integral to many economics, but we're still talking about a physical substance you ingest. More importantly, it offers virtually no benefit to the user aside from a temporarily alerted internal state, not to mention the numerous and even fatal drawbacks. Social media, in any sense of the term, simply does not compare to that at all. Whatever negative consequences it may entail, and there certainly seem to be some serious ones, they are counterbalanced by an absolutely extraordinary wealth of radical benefits. Some of you might remember this, other of the younger viewers probably not, but I definitely do. Around a decade ago, social media was a lifeline for millions of Egyptians, Tunisians, and others during the Arab Spring. It allowed protesters to communicate and organize beyond the reach of government censorship. And in the years since, the newfound ability of everyday Americans to film what has happened before their own eyes and upload it for the world to see launched the Black Lives Matter movement, which, by mid-2020 after the death of George Floyd, the New York Times estimated could potentially be the largest movement in the United States history. Many of these online movements also attract misinformation and stir up heated arguments on social media, but it can be argued that prior to online remote arguments, people simply arguing face-to-face in public was, really no more productive and oftentimes could be more violent. And if you look into this, there's actually lots of evidence supporting it. A paper published by Harvard University in 2011 supports the claim that violence has declined per capita around the world quite significantly in recent decades. A book published by Cambridge University Press in 2013 by Professor Joshua S. Goldstein focuses on a similar claim. As for the claim that the political disagreements used to be dealt with in the streets instead of the internet, history books are riddled with examples. How about the Salem witch trials? Or maybe the long and gory history of atheism, and the way the debates about God have traditionally been settled. What about the assassination of Gandhi, who, virtually alone in his suggesting the Indian government be welcoming and tolerant towards the Pakistani Muslims post-partition, was promptly shot to death at point-blank range in broad daylight by a Hindu nationalist? Or, if you're really feeling adventurous, what about Yale historian Joanne B. Freeman's mind-blowing book, The Field of Blood, which describes how debates in the United States Congress, of all places, used to be moderated primarily between physical intimidation, violence, and even fatal duels prior to the Civil War. And, sure, today many of us will shake our heads in dismay when we see elected officials bickering with each other on Twitter. But imagine how you'd feel if, AOC and Ted Cruz simply went out into a field and started, firing rifles at each other. For that matter, imagine how much less settled their dispute would actually be in the aftermath. Yet, less than 2 centuries ago, that's quite possibly what they would have done instead. All of this goes to show that even if it doesn't feel like it, there are lots of ways we are much, much better off in today's online world than we used to be. Are we really addicts for gravitating towards a more and more safe environment? Suddenly, the question takes on a very different meaning. Social media poses its own set of risks and consequences, but their trade-offs or the reduction or even outright elimination of countless other risks and consequences that are arguably much worse and used to be more widespread. Now, consider it this way. Are we addicted to driving? Gas-powered cars pollute the environment and accelerate climate change, and car accidents injure 3 million Americans every year. Yet we continue to swarm the roads in larger and larger numbers. Nobody even asks the question because we understand that owning a car and driving it around is often an essential behavior for working people despite the risk. Our proposed solutions for the risk all tend to focus on ways to make driving better for the environment and safer for drivers. For example, with electric self-driving cars, nobody seriously proposes we quit transportation altogether. And a counter-argument to the claim that we're addicted to social media could, in a nutshell, be that social media platforms are more like cars than they're like drugs. They're inexorably incorporated into the fabric of the economy and the culture, and we're not so much addicted as we're immersed in a new society built around them. We're also not going to get rid of them. Instead, we should be looking at ways in which, on a societal level, they're causing harm and work towards practical solutions to make our collective use less destructive. And maybe on an individual level, we should be looking at ways to improve the health of our usage while maintaining our relationship with the technology and its many benefits, similar to how we would look to reduce our own carbon footprint. Whether we're addicted to social media or social media is becoming an irreversible part of human civilization, the question still remains, what are we going to do about it? As I mentioned earlier, organizations like the Center for Human Technology are forcing incremental changes such as Facebook's implementation of new tools to help users track their own behavior. Google and Apple have recently introduced similar tools. But critics are skeptical. For instance, Brian A. Primrick, who directs the Center for Research on Media Technology and Health at the University of Pittsburgh, points out the fact that warning labels in both physical and digital form don't really work. He also questioned whether measuring hours on the app alone is enough to really alter behavior. Other vocal critics like Tristan Harris have voiced similar concerns and urged companies like Facebook to implement more aggressive strategies. But personally, I have to say I'm a bit skeptical of this happening because, businesses may donate generously to charities. Hell, they even make sacrifices in certain domains for certain periods if management deems it a potentially profitable long-term strategy. But I can't say I've ever heard of a business voluntarily slashing long-term profitability in the name of a cause. If it does happen, it's probably pretty rare. Now, what's more likely to happen is that businesses will change its practices when the law itself forces them to. Just take a look at what's happened in the last half century with cigarette manufacturers. Marlboro and other manufacturers now put warnings about lung cancer and pictures of sick children on the packaging, but, do they think this is a profitable marketing strategy? Of course not. They simply have no choice but to comply with the regulations. Tristan Harris has also proposed imposing a tax on data collection. Data collection is the bread and butter of how social media apps generate value. As Sandy Parakilis has explained to us earlier, the data collection about user behavior is what feeds the addiction algorithm. There is currently no tax on data collection, although in February this year, a senator from New York tried to introduce a bill changing that. This is a way to forcibly alter the profit mechanism so that, from a strictly financial perspective, unlimited data collection might actually not be the most lucrative strategy. That sounds like a real solution to my ears. In ending, Facebook needs to believe that people using their apps less will make them more money in the long run. or they have to be legally demanded to make their apps less addictive. Either way, the responsibility ultimately falls on us as the consumers and voters. Who are we electing, and what is their stance on social media and technology? Do they even understand technology to begin with? How are we using our own social media accounts? Now, Mark Zuckerberg is worth over $100 billion because we all use his company's various platforms. While an outright boycott would be difficult, if not downright impossible, we as users are in the most powerful position to demand better. But in a domain where every action we take is tracked and stored, we have to make those demands not just with our words, but with our behavior. Anyways, thanks for taking a look at this not so fun fact Friday, and checking out Thinkology. If you like and subscribe, maybe I'll give you your kneecaps back. That'll be cool. Anyways, this has been Oz, your local floor goblin. I hope to see you next time.